The first snow of November came the night before they said anything, which was the night Celestina Mora dragged the fourth bundle of dried corn stalks from the field to the base of her cabin wall and propped it up with the same methodical patience she brought to everything she did alone. Welcome to Historias Entre Vidas. The Sierra Madre had a particular silence in those hours before real cold set in. A held breath quality, as if the mountain itself were deciding. Celestina had lived on that slope for 31 years, and she knew what that silence meant. She stacked another bundle. She was 58 years old and had been a widow for 2. Her husband, Rodrigo, had died in October of the year before. Not dramatically. He had simply stopped, the way strong men sometimes do, between one breath and the next, in the chair on the porch he had sat in every evening since they built the place together. She had found him there in the afternoon with his hands in his lap and his face turned toward the valley, and she had sat beside him for a long time before she did anything else. She had said, quietly, "Primero Dios," because that was what her mother had always said at the edge of things that could not be controlled, and the habit held even now. The cabin was hers now. The field was hers. The goats, 3 of them, stubborn and opinionated and named for no principle she could explain, were hers. And the winter was coming, which was also hers to deal with, which was the thing about winters when you are the only one left. They become entirely personal. She had begun in September, when the corn came in. The stalks were tall and dry, and she tied them in bundles as Rodrigo had shown her years ago. Not for insulation then, but for storage. This year she looked at the bundles and thought differently. The cabin walls were adobe, 2 generations old, and good walls, but she had felt the cold come through them last January in a way she had not felt before. Not because the walls had changed, but because she had no one beside her in the bed, and a body beside you is a kind of insulation too, and she did not have that anymore. So she stacked the bundles against the base of the north and west walls, tied them at the top to keep them from the wind, and covered them with pitch-soaked cloth she cut from an old tarp. It took 3 weeks, working an hour each morning and an hour each evening after the goats were in. The neighbors noticed on the 2nd week. Florencia Estrada was the first, because Florencia was always first when there was something to say. She had come up the slope road with her daughter-in-law and stopped at the fence and looked at the cornstalk walls with the expression of a woman who has found something worth repeating. "What is that?" she asked. "Insulation," said Celestina, without stopping work. "From cornstalks. From cornstalks." Florencia said nothing more that day. But what she said later, to her daughter-in-law, to the women at the market on Friday, to her husband who mentioned it to 3 other men, was that poor Celestina had gone a little strange since Rodrigo died, which was understandable. A woman alone at that altitude in that kind of cabin. But that someone should probably check on her because she was wrapping her house in cornfield garbage and calling it construction. Aurelio Campos, who ran the general store at the base of the mountain and had opinions on everything from crop prices to the weather to the private decisions of his neighbors, said it more directly when Celestina came in for supplies that Saturday. "You know the mice will get into those stalks," he said. "You'll have a worse problem than cold." "I've treated them," said Celestina. She bought her flour and her salt and her oil and went home. His wife Dolores said it differently, with a kind of pity that was more cutting than any criticism. "She doesn't know what she's doing," she told the women at the wash basin on Monday. "She's doing it because Rodrigo used to do something like it, I think, and she's trying to remember him. It's the loneliness. You know how it is." Celestina knew they were talking. She had lived on that slope long enough to know that sound travels in mountains the way it travels nowhere else, not through walls, but through the specific attentiveness of people who share a terrain. She said nothing, she stacked another bundle. The days had a shape to them now that the first winter without Rodrigo had taught her to build deliberately rather than inherit. She rose before light, which the Sierra demanded whether you wanted it to or not. She stoked the fire and heated the coffee on the wood stove, Rodrigo's stove, solid cast iron, older than their marriage and likely to outlast the cabin. And she drank it standing at the window that looked east toward where the sun came up behind the ridge. She did this not from sentiment, but from practicality. The east window told her the temperature and the quality of the coming day in a way no other indicator did. The color of the light, the presence or absence of the particular low cloud that meant weather, was organizing itself above the tree line. Then the goats. Their names were Petra, Consuelo, and a third one Rodrigo had called Severa because of her disposition, and Celestina had kept the name because it was accurate. She fed them and checked their hooves and their eyes, and their general state of opinion about the world, which Severa communicated directly and the other two more obliquely, and then she let them into the upper field for the 2 hours before the cold settled in fully. Then, the corn stalks. She had developed a method. She worked the north wall in the morning when the light was good and the cold wasn't yet biting, carrying the bundles 2 at a time from the field edge, propping them at the angle the frost patterns on the wall suggested. Where the cold came through most, she packed deepest. She had been watching those patterns for weeks, observing the way the moisture collected in different parts of the wall, and the cornstalk placement followed what she saw rather than what she planned in advance, which was a way of working she had always trusted more than blueprints. In the evenings she worked by the south wall, which was easier, and which she did after supper when the sky was still pale and she had enough light to tie the bundles securely. The heavy wool coat hung on the hook inside the door. Rodrigo's coat, charcoal gray, smelling still of wood smoke and lanolin, and something she couldn't name that was simply him, and she put it on for the evening work, because the temperature dropped fast after 4 o'clock, and she was not a woman who believed in being cold when she didn't have to be. The coat was too big for her. It always had been. Rodrigo had been broad through the shoulders in a way she had always been glad of. And the coat fell past her hips, and the sleeves covered her hands, and she worked in it anyway, which was either practical or sentimental depending on your point of view, and she did not care much which. The recipe notebook was in the kitchen on the shelf above the wood stove. It had been her mother's, transferred to her at marriage in the way of such things, handwritten, stained, densely annotated, with 3 recipes crossed out entirely and replaced with better versions on the facing pages, and a section at the back in Celestina's own hand for the things she had learned since. She cooked from it every Sunday, not because she needed to consult it for recipes she knew by memory, but because holding it was a way of holding a conversation with the women who had held it before her. She made the Sunday soup from the recipe her mother had adjusted from her grandmother's version, and she ate it at the table where she and Rodrigo had eaten for 31 winters, and she looked at his empty chair and talked to him sometimes, which she had stopped being embarrassed about around the 3rd month. She told him about the corn stalks. She told him she was doing it her own way and that he should not feel the need to supervise from wherever he was. She told him the goats missed him, which was probably not true but was the kind of thing she said anyway, because Severa had been difficult since October and something had to explain it. The mockery sharpened as the bundles grew. Aurelio Campos mentioned it to 2 more people the following Saturday. A young man named Jacinto, who lived at the far end of the road, came by the fence one afternoon and looked at the work with unconcealed amusement, and said that his wife had heard about the cornstalks and wanted to know if Celestina was planning to build a scarecrow next. Celestina looked at him for a moment. "Ask your wife how well her walls hold in January," she said. "Then tell me." Jacinto said nothing more and went back down the road. Celestina went back to work. The old apple tree at the corner of the yard had lost its leaves 3 weeks ago and stood now in the November light with its bare branches showing the structure underneath, which was better than the full-leafed version in certain ways. You could see what the tree actually was, what held it up, what had been growing quietly all along beneath the green. Celestina had always liked the apple tree in November for this reason. It was honest in the cold. It was while she was working, on a Thursday morning in early November, clearing the last of the storage room to make space for the winter provisions, that she found the journal. It was in a wooden box she had not opened since August, a cedar box with a worn brass latch that she kept under the shelf where Rodrigo had stored his tools. She had been moving the box to reach a stack of grain sacks behind it when the latch caught on a nail and the lid came open, and she saw, underneath a folded piece of canvas, the corner of a leather notebook she did not recognize. She sat down on the storage room floor the way you sit down when your legs decide for you. The notebook was small, the size of a man's palm, bound in dark leather that had softened with age and with handling. The pages were dense with Rodrigo's handwriting, not the fast, careless script of his shopping lists and fence notes, but something more deliberate, more patient, as though he had been writing for a reader he could not yet picture and wanted to be understood precisely. She turned to the first page. At the top, in the careful handwriting, he had written a date, October, 22 years ago, and below that, things my grandfather taught me that I do not want to lose. She read for an hour on the floor of the storage room with the wool coat pooled around her and the goats indifferent outside. Rodrigo's grandfather had been a man of the High Sierra in the generation before the road was paved, which meant he had lived through winters that the current generation could barely imagine. The journal recorded what the old man had known and passed down. Not in the voice of instruction, but in the voice of memory, Rodrigo writing what he remembered being told, which gave everything a doubled quality, the grandfather's knowledge filtered through Rodrigo's attention and care. How to bank a stove to last through a night on a third of the wood. How to read the first freeze by the behavior of the insects in the field the week before. How to determine which walls of an adobe structure would lose heat fastest based on the angle of the prevailing wind. And, on the third page, written in a slightly different ink as though added later, the cornstalk insulation technique, which the grandfather had used in the blizzard of 1952 to keep 6 people alive in a 2-room cabin for 3 days when the fuel ran out and the temperature dropped to numbers nobody in that generation had names for. Rodrigo had recorded it exactly. The angle of the bundles, leaned rather than upright, to shed water rather than collect it. The treatment against moisture and rodents, a mixture of ash and pine resin worked into the outer layers. The ideal depth against stone walls versus adobe. The time method at the top, using wire rather than rope, because rope contracts in cold. The specific instruction about the north and west exposures, which took the wind and needed double depth. And then, at the bottom of the page, and the particular handwriting of a man noting something personal rather than practical. When we are older and the winters feel longer, this is what we will do for our cabin. When we are older. Celestina read those 4 words 3 times. She pressed her palm flat on the page, over the handwriting, as if she could feel the warmth of the hand that had made it through all the years between. He had planned for their old age. He had spent an afternoon 22 years ago, carefully recording his grandfather's knowledge so that it would be available when they needed it. He had not told her, because he was a man who expressed love through preparation rather than announcement, who fixed the gate hinge before the gate fell rather than after, who restocked the medicine shelf before it ran out, who had written down everything his grandfather knew so that she would have it if she ever needed it alone, which he had not planned for but which she now understood he had somehow, in the way of people who love carefully, provided for anyway. He had written it for both of them, and she was using it for one. That was not what he had meant. But it was what she had, and she would not waste it. She got up from the floor. She put the journal in the pocket of the wool coat. She went back to the corn stalks, and this time she followed the journal's instructions precisely. The angle, the treatment, the depth, the wire tie at the top. And when she finished the north wall that afternoon, she stepped back and looked at it and said, quietly, to the cold air and the mountain and wherever he was, "You were right about the wire. Lo que ninguno de los vecinos que la estaban mirando había imaginado todavía era que en días das iba a llegar la nevada más severa que había caído sobre la Sierra Madre en 20 años." What none of the neighbors watching her had yet imagined was that in 10 days the worst blizzard to fall on the Sierra Madre in 20 years was going to arrive. It began on a Wednesday evening with the particular quality of quiet Celestina had noticed in early November, the held-breath silence, the mountain deciding. By Thursday morning the road down the slope was impassable. By Thursday afternoon the snow was at the base of the cabin door. By Friday morning it was at the window ledge on the north side, and the wind had dropped the temperature inside every uninsulated structure on the slope by 15 degrees, and 3 families had lost their livestock because the animal shelters weren't built for sustained cold at that depth. Celestina's cabin held at 61 degrees inside. She knew this because she had a thermometer Rodrigo had mounted on the interior north wall 20 years ago. And she checked it every morning with the same attentiveness she gave to the goats and the fire. The goats were fine. She had brought them inside the storage room on Wednesday night, which the neighbors also would have mocked if they had seen it, and they were producing milk on Thursday morning as if nothing unusual had occurred, which was the particular indifference of goats to human drama. By Friday midday, Florencia Estrada knocked on Celestina's door. She came with her daughter-in-law and the daughter-in-law's 2 children, the youngest one coughing in a way that meant they had been cold for too long. The wood in their house had run low, and the supply road was gone, and the walls of their house, which was newer than Celestina's and made of concrete block, had no insulation at all and were conducting the cold the way concrete does, evenly, efficiently, without mercy. "Come in," said Celestina. She opened the door wider. Florencia stepped in and stopped. The cabin was warm. Not the desperate warmth of a fire pushed too hard, but the settled warmth of a space that has retained its heat through the architecture of its walls, the warmth of a place that has been prepared rather than rescued. She looked at Celestina. She looked at the thermometer on the north wall. She looked at the coat hanging on the hook by the door. "How?" she said. It was not quite a question. "Corn stalks," said Celestina. "Sit down. I'll make coffee." She made it in the large clay pot, the one for company that Rodrigo had bought at the market in Durango the year they celebrated their 10th anniversary. She had not used it since the funeral gathering, which she did not allow herself to think about now. She made the coffee strong and poured it into whatever cup she had, and handed the youngest child, the coughing one, a cup of warm goat's milk with piloncillo, and watched the child drink it in both hands with the automatic gratitude of a small body being warmed. Florencia sat at the table and said nothing for a long time. Her daughter-in-law put the 2 children on the wool blanket near the stove. Outside the wind moved along the north wall. Celestina could hear it, had been listening to it for 2 days, and found no purchase. The corn stalks took the force of it and held. Over the next 2 days, 4 more families came. Aurelio Campos came with his wife Dolores on Saturday morning, which Celestina received without comment. She moved the table. She added wood carefully, banking the fire the way the journal specified, not piled but laid flat, less flame and more sustained heat, fuel lasting twice as long at a third of the drama. She made room. She divided what she had. The goats, crowded now into the far end of the storage room with an indignation that Severa communicated to the walls at intervals, were still producing milk, which she warmed in the clay pot and served to the children and to Florencia's elderly mother-in-law, who had come on the second day and had not complained once about anything, which Celestina respected. The children slept in layers on the floor. The adults took turns at the 2 chairs near the fire. Someone had brought tortillas, already cold when they arrived but revivable on the comal. Someone else had brought a bag of dried beans that Celestina put in the pot with what she had. And by Saturday evening there was enough for everyone. Not generously, but enough, which was what the journal's grandfather had called the arithmetic of crisis. Enough is the only number that matters. She had not planned to feed 7 additional people for 2 days. But the wood held, and the fire held, and the walls held, and the cabin was 61 degrees on Friday, and 60 on Saturday, and 59 on Sunday morning when the storm broke, which was 3 degrees warmer than it needed to be to keep everyone safe. Dolores Campos sat beside Celestina on the evening of the second day and did not apologize, because the kind of woman Dolores was did not apologize directly. But she said, "This is a good house. You built it right. Rodrigo built it right," said Celestina. "I just read what he left me." Dolores looked at her. The corn stalks, and other things. He wrote it all down. 30 years of preparation, God willing we'd use it together. We only got to use it once. Dolores was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He was a good man." "Yes," said Celestina, "he was. I'm still finding out how good." The blizzard ended on Sunday morning. The sky cleared the way Sierra skies clear after a storm. Completely, suddenly, with a brightness that made the snow on every surface look as though it had been placed there deliberately. The families on the slope began the work of clearing and assessing and accounting for what had been lost and what had held. Celestina's cabin had held everything. 2 weeks later, on a Sunday afternoon when the road was passable again and the worst of the damage had been tallied, and the community had begun the slow particular work of helping each other repair what the blizzard had taken, the families of the slope came to Celestina's cabin. Not because anyone had planned it, but because that is what happens in small mountain communities when a place has earned a certain kind of authority. They came with food, and with tools, and with children running ahead of them in the snow, and they sat together in the yard in the winter sun, and Celestina made coffee, and Florencia brought bread, and Aurelio Campos, who was a man of few adjustments, but made them when the evidence was clear, helped mend the fence that the weight of the snow had pushed down on the east side. Nobody said anything about the cornstalks directly. But a younger man from the far end of the road asked Celestina, while they were working on the fence, if she would be willing to show him the technique. He said his cabin was also adobe, and also old, and he had a family and 3 young children. "Bring your notebook," said Celestina, "and I'll show you what Rodrigo wrote." She went inside and came back with the journal. Then they sat on the porch in the winter light, and she read him what her husband had prepared for a future they were supposed to share, and which she was sharing in a way neither of them had imagined. And so, where before there had been mockery, there was now a particular kind of respect, the kind that doesn't announce itself but shows up in how a person is greeted, in the space made for them at a gathering, in the way a question is asked rather than a judgment delivered. The slope road had a name for it, though no one said it out loud. They just knew. Did you ever understand someone's love late? Someone who didn't always know how to say it, but never stopped holding a place for you in their life? If this story moved something in you, leave us a comment and tell us where you're watching from. We read every one. Subscribe to Historias Entrevidas and ring the bell so you don't miss a single story. Share it with someone who carries a person in their heart who showed love in quiet ways, through work, through preparation, through the things they left behind. Until the next story, a heartfelt embrace. And from then on, in the community along that stretch of the Sierra Madre, they said that the wisest cabin on the slope was the one with the cornstalk walls, and that the woman who built it had learned everything she knew from someone who loved her in a language that took a blizzard to translate.